everybody, to our fifth community conversation. It's wonderful to be with you. I'm Fyodor, your co-host with Corey Morrow here, and we're honored to have Natsai Audrey Chieza as our conversation starter today. In our fest tradition, we will start with showing you a Miro board with some information about fest and the flow of today. FAST stands for Financial Ecosystems for Systemic Transformation. And we are here to greatly accelerate the development of the field of financing of systemic transformation, FST as a field, to address today's social inequality, economic and environmental crises. And we are practitioners, thought leaders, and other stakeholders in the field of financing systemic transformation. Agenda for today: welcome and check-in, and then you will connect in small groups to talk a little bit more about why you're here. Then we will hear from Natsai. She will present for about 10 minutes, and we'll end this presentation with a provocation. Then you will discuss the provocation. After that, you come back, and Corey will facilitate your group reflections. After the group reflections, Natsai will share some thoughts on that discussion that happened today. And we will go into fast announcements. And then after that, closing and checkout. With that, Corey, would you do check-in with us?
Yeah, thank you, Fyodor. So as this is a community call, please let's get us started by dropping your name in the chat and share where you're calling in from. Also share, in addition to your name and your location, one project that you'd like to see funded or one pattern in financing systemic transformation that you'd like to see amplified. Thank you, everybody, for sharing here. I'm going to let you all follow along, and then we have a prompt for you. We're going to break out into small groups. These are the same small groups that we're going to use later in the call, but right now this will just be a chance to get to know each other a little bit. And really the question that we'd like you to discuss with each other is, what is the learning journey you are on regarding systemic transformation? So that's what you'll be discussing in small groups to get to know each other a little bit, and we'll come back here and we'll see a brief presentation from Natsai, and she'll set us up with a conversation starter. So the idea is hopefully you've got to speak with somebody who you have never spoken with before, or maybe don't speak with on a regular basis, and got to learn a little bit about their learning journey and what interests them, perhaps what challenges them, what their context is. We have just a couple minutes here before Natsai starts, or before Fyodor is going to introduce Natsai. What did you take from that conversation? What struck you about the conversation that you just had?
Well, I was in a group with Alessandro, Manuel, and Tracy, and Manuel shared an example of work he's doing with Territorio Futuros, looking at the wildfires and actually doing some systemic analysis. And they developed 8 levers, which made me think of the 4 levers that I'm working on for affordable housing crisis here. But I just made me think, Fyodor and co, that there's such amazing people in this group who have tremendous case studies and models and solutions. And I'm just wondering, do you guys have a repository? Like, are you building a database with all these amazing examples? Because we can learn so much from each other, and we're going to need models very shortly as we go through that volatile transition that Andy Johord likes to talk about. And I think conversations are great, but we're also just going to need models for regular people.
Yeah, thank you, Francesca.
I came in on the tail end of a conversation, but I think that what was really inspiring for me when Donna was speaking was just this idea that we're not going to philanthropy our way out of the problem. And so just kind of understanding that even when you do put the resources in a particular direction, that it still feeds back into the system. And I think that that's like a real important part of really just even shifting the consciousness around what solidarity looks like and what an alternative system looks like in a real way, to participate in it, not just in theory, but in practice. And so I think that's what's coming up for me, is just this idea, like, what are the systems that we're feeding as a result of reallocating the funds? Because if we do all this donating and then, it's great and it goes to where it needs to go, and then people just feel more empowered to participate in capitalism, and then we're kind of just like in the same circle. And so that's what I think is like driving in my mind right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Dior. Okay, so we're going to have more time to chat in small groups and in the large group. But right now I want to hand it over to Fyodor to introduce Natsai, our conversation starter.
Thank you, Corey. And before I do that, just a little bit of recap of the journey that we've been on in this series. If you take a look at all the conversations we've had so far, you can see it's our fifth conversation. It was not supposed to be series first. It was supposed to be just different people coming in and sharing some provocations. I was the first conversation starter back in September last year. And so my question was about coherence across scales. So how are you dancing with the polarity of high context systems change work on the ground, and also the high levels of abstraction that is happening at the scale at which transformation needs to happen fast. Then we heard from Sarah Edwards from Cambridge Associates. That was a large-scale institutional investor perspective. Then we heard from Jen van der Meer, our FESCO steward, who shared the perspective of practice academic. And then finally, we heard from Leon Seefeld from Dark Matter Labs about bioregional financing facilities, intermediary structures between the local scale and the large abstract scale. So, and today we are going to hear from Natsai Audrey Chieza, who is an award-winning designer. Natsai does technology innovation, and that technology is future fit. But at the same time, there are systemic barriers to this technology realizing its transformational potential. And with that, let me pass it to Natsai to give us a presentation.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be able to talk with you all today. Very briefly, my background is that I trained as an architect before sort of coming into the world of biodesign, which I've been involved in for the last 15 years. As a designer who is interested in the intersection between technology, material, and culture, and the technology that I was most fascinated by when I was studying was biotechnology. And the fact that you had synthetic biologists, scientists who are engineering biology, who talk about designing living systems. And as a designer, I thought, oh, that's brilliant. You're designing at a particular scale. I think in architectural scale, there must be a place where we can meet and talk about how our work parlays. And so I developed an independent research practice, dabbling in different biotech labs across the world, to get closer to what does it mean to design with living systems? What does it mean to design at a molecular scale? What are the tools? What are the languages? What are the implications? And how can design be a way through which we can start to make meaning out of what is happening in the laboratory and insofar as it relates to the real world? In 2018, I established Faber Futures as a creative R&D studio and lab that is advancing regenerative bioeconomy through this lens of technology, materials, and systems design. And our R&D platform really sits at this intersection of the scientific research, but like translation through cultural knowledge and cultural, building that cultural competency, as well as design practice, which is about a situational, contextual basis from which we think about how we design the world around us. And so through sort of cross-sector engagement, collaboration, different partnerships, we're really at the forefront of translating this kind of emerging biological innovation as it manifests as materials for alternatives to petrochemicals, for example, but into real world intervention. What is that journey? What does it look like so that we can translate these technologies? And so normal phenomena of life is our translation layer at Faber Futures. We established it in 23, and it really functions as a biotechnology sort of developer platform on the back end, where we engage with technology companies building next generation materials from biology. And on the front end, through product development, it becomes this sort of e-com consumer facing brand where we are validating that technology through real products, through real regulatory frameworks, through the need to be able to have fluency around what is this material, what does it mean that it exists, effectively market building. So this process, or through this process, NPOL is building that pipeline for product market fit, supply chain integration, as well as the cultural and market infrastructure that enables a bioeconomy to scale. I think the thesis was that just, the technology alone is enough. And I think we are understanding that if you upstream this part, you can start to actually really push what the technology does. So really, this is a feedback loop between research, industry, consumers, and nature. The living systems provide the contextual conditions, whether it's soil, oceans, biodiversity, climate. Faber Futures is generating the biological design knowledge, and normal phenomena of life translates it into new markets, production models, behaviors, and culture. And I thought it was really important to share with you the sort of competing mental models that determine how this system unfolds. The first, which is also the dominant thesis, that is driving how we do all sorts of different things, including how we think about investing in the field, treats biology's variability, complexity, and artisanal character as a deficiency, something that needs to be overcome through standardization, replicability, and centralized industrial scale, effectively borrowing from the petrochemical industrial basis for biology, which in nature doesn't behave like that. In fact, it behaves a little bit like what the characteristics of the second mental model want us to engage with, which is that same qualities, the variability, the complexity, and the artisanal are an opportunity, the basis for a different production system designed for locality, skill, and bounded variation. So our work at Faber Futures and NPOL, Normal Phenomena of Life, is really concerned with this opportunity space, because this for us is where we think most of the systemic change happens. Incumbents love the deficiency mindset because it means that they just have to focus on a drop-in replacement into an existing system, the same winners, the same losers, just you change the ingredients. And I think what we're saying is biology doesn't do that in nature. What if we actually look to industry, not to industrialize biology, instead to biologize industry? What could that mean and manifest instead? So I'm just going to share a couple of key projects that sort of bring this all to life. From our R&D stack, we have a key project here called NPOL, which is where we focus our efforts on microbial dyes. And we've done this to really build an understanding of what is biodesign? What's at stake? And what are the opportunities if we can get it right? And it starts with this organism that is found in the soil called Streptomyces silicola. In the soil, it's decomposing organic matter, doing all sorts of great ecosystem services. You take it into the lab and it produces a blue pigment in isolation. And that blue pigment is an antibiotic, but it's also possible, as we discovered, to dye textiles with it. And so we've been on a very long journey trying to figure out what it means that we can use this microbe to dye textiles. And the reason why we've stayed at it is because of the sustainability credentials around this system, which is that we are massively reducing water use, as well as dyeing textiles without any toxins, which is increasingly becoming an important piece of the puzzle for regenerative materials. And so the lab has been concerned with figuring out how to work with living systems in a design context, a lot of the times resulting in funding for this work coming from cultural institutions. And I always say that cultural institutions are funding innovation and technology. Do they know that they're doing that? And what if they did know? What kind of posture would they carry if they knew that it would have been impossible for us to build this body of work were it not for the Cooper Hewitts of the world commissioning us to bring these worlds together in a more fundamental way? In recent times, we have won grants with Innovate UK to ask slightly deeper questions around design at what scale. This recent project with a company called Evoluta, we decided to look at the microbes themselves. There's a big problem with scaling biology and why so many biotech companies are coming up against the wall. The fundamentals of how you scale fermentation. One of the key questions is, where does the sugar come from to ferment these microbes so that they can make these compounds for us? And usually it comes from the Amazon. So this project was really asking a different question, which is, what if we could train these microbes to eat waste residues at source? The implication of that, should this work, is that we can start to imagine a bioeconomy that's decentralized, where microbes are able to convert feedstocks in different regions, different capabilities to produce a different outcome, which brings in a fundamentally different architecture of how we view the bioeconomy. And so we worked with a consortia of microbes that effectively taught each other how to eat different kinds of food waste, because that's what happens sometimes when you mush biology together. It kind of does what biology does best. So we trained these consortia of microbes to eat different waste residues from the food system, which opened up this incredible new value chain for textile economy, and one that could be, and this came up in our discussion earlier, be rooted in so many different contexts. In this example, London City is the place where we start to see this technological stack open up. So we have Grow Farm, which is in East London, who have a regenerative farm that can supply a zero waste restaurant like Silo. Silo is zero waste because they have focused on eliminating waste. And we imagined in the system, working with them, how some of their pumpkin waste could actually be used to grow our microbes, to dye textiles, and all within a footprint of less than 30 kilometers. And I think it's a very important example of how you start to build value chains locally, or rather, it's an important example of how biology starts. It can enable you to build value chains locally without us having to have a very huge footprint on production. Increasingly, we're starting to think about infrastructure because a lot of these artisanal scale to fit models don't have infrastructure that exists to hold the making of. And so typically you might focus on a microbe that can produce a pigment, and that your scale out journey is fermenting in large bioreactors or tanks, and you're going to dye it in that way. But actually, because we are focused on the artisanal, we're interested in textile craft as being part of that value add. And so when we think about the various infrastructures that are related to how we actually make this stuff and how we can make it at scale, none of it exists. So we're invited to the Weenweed Atelier to build a project in Friesland, in the Netherlands, in a region of the country that is experiencing water level rises due to climate change. And so collectively, stakeholders within this region are thinking about what other new economic and production models they may be able to adopt and adapt as the industry changes from dairy farming being the key thing that happens then. And so through this project, we were able to map the kinds of stakeholders that a textile economy based on biomanufacturing through this lens of biodesign, and specifically with the microbial dyes, opens up. And this became a propositional space for us to think about, how do we build the capabilities on the ground? We understand that we have microbes that are feedstock agnostic. We understand the textile piece, but this is also a region that is producing linen. Can that become a key substrate? And how does this fit within the cultural vernacular of that place? And then what other technological capabilities need to be on the ground to make that happen? And so working with the local stakeholders through workshops and prototyping, we developed a value chain to actually produce textiles there. But we also proposed that the new kinds of infrastructures that we need to plug into some of these environments could look like workspaces, labs that are connected to farm environments, sequestering energy from the different functions on the farm. In this example, compost is being used to generate the heat that powers the system. And so looking at sustainability, not just as is this a sustainable material, but the process itself and the situational aspects of it. How can we make sure that we're doing everything across the board to make this as regenerative as possible? The last project I'd like to share with you is this sort of translation layer, NPOL. And what's exciting about this is it takes a different posture, because suddenly it's a direct-to-consumer brand, and we have to find ways of making these possibilities not just legible, but irresistible. And so that storytelling becomes important, and that through product development, i.e. taking these materials and turning them into consumer products, becomes a very important exercise in building the market conditions that are going to make it worthwhile to do any of that R&D at scale. And so we've developed NPOL Originals, which are products that we are making in-house. This is a great example of a lamp that's made with bioconcrete, microbes that know how to turn sand into stone. So that's the material component, but the lamp itself is made for disassembly. And so the repair component comes into it. And with that, you're not just designing the lamp, you're actually designing the system that you want it to go through. We designed, in collaboration with an artist, a beautiful set of limited edition prints using algae-based ink, here to demonstrate performance and efficacy, and embedding this new technology into a time-honored typographical art medium. And then, of course, with our microbial dye, this was an incredible opportunity to translate our R&D into consumer products and really ask this question of scale. How big a bioreactor can we grow these organisms in so that we can get X amount of textiles, and to start building some economic fundamentals around that? And it's a really exciting artifact for me, not least because of all of the people who came together to make it happen, but because When we came to actually developing the language around the label is a promise. All of those things had to be true. And so suddenly you look at the labels on your clothes and you're like, what story are they telling us about the system in which this artifact actually exists in? And for us to be able to say that this can be washed a certain way, that the pigments are going to be color fast, so much R&D has happened for us to be able to finally put this into the world. And so NPOL for us is a really important piece of this puzzle to help others beyond us validate and de-risk their commercial journey. And in terms of the value creation here, this is just, I don't think it has been revised in a while, but this was an ecosystem map of what it takes to get something like that off the ground, and that every individual on this map is a decision about not just how your regenerative kind of approach to design and sustainability is working, but the kinds of organizations you pull into that orbit so that you can amplify the good work that's happening as well. And so there's a organizational and governance layer to this question of regenerative tech. It really matters who you work with, and we didn't go into that blind. And so I'll close with this systems map of our interconnected activities. And I think one of the key things being said at the top of this conversation is we know how to do and to fund individual elements of this puzzle, but we don't do this in a coordinated way. So that's why we're not seeing the full fruits of this labor manifest in the way that the potential and the promise holds. We know how to fund the molecule, the machine, the pilot, but not the system that makes it durable, regenerative, coherent, and transformation. So the question that I have for all of you today is, what kind of funding architectures can speak to the interconnected activities that this project map can reveal? And I'll stop there.
Wow, thank you, Natsai. And so this sets us up for some very rich discussion. We're going to break back out into the same groups for this discussion. The question is, designing technologies for a radically different future. We know how to fund the molecule, the machine, and the pilot, but not the system that makes the technology regenerative, durable, coherent, and transformational. So what funding architectures can finance that?
Thank you, Corey. And before we go into breakout rooms, one important thing I also wanted to share with you based on the previous 4 conversations is a reminder that at FEST, we're working on holding space for multiple perspectives. So we have people from the finance world, we have people from projects of different kinds, people from philanthropy sometimes don't understand people from investing and vice versa. So it is likely that you will encounter some kind of language clash. And this is normal. This doesn't mean that whatever you're hearing is a distraction, or that you just need to do your homework and learn something before joining this conversation. You can learn something during the conversation. So in its invitation to approach everything with curiosity and love and care, and be okay with things that might not seem very familiar. Every perspective is essential for this big complex thing we're trying to engage in, not figure out, because figuring it out completely is impossible. So 20 minutes, everybody.
So I just wanted to say, first things first, what fabulous work. The work I do in regenerative forestry was preceded by, I have a B Corp global supply chain company manufacturing products. So I just want to say how much I really appreciate the challenge that you have, because, the jacket, beautiful, £4,000, right? Like, this is the challenge. How do you make it work? So very, very much understanding the thing. And I think all of us need to recognize that one of the big challenges for creating the generational local productivity of kind of production and enabling us to actually mimic biology again, which focuses on the locality, not on the global. Like, there's no king tree in a forest. It's just a collection of mother trees. And I love what you said about biology. Just when you put biology together, it works out how to fix something in its environment, because that's what we all do as living beings. And I just wanted to say the big thing that came out of our call was the challenge about this whole thing is both physical movement on the planet and financial movement on the planet. The systems that facilitate distribution are controlled fundamentally by these centralized systems that we're all actually here to try and disrupt and find a way around. And I think this is one of the challenges with the whole thing, is to support these new kind of localized, very biomimicry style versions of production and creation and then distribution of those to the markets, both locally and globally, if we have to rely on some of the fundamental structures that we have now, the challenge is not how do we get these things funded, but how do we get these things funded outside of the current system totally? Because otherwise the current system will just co-opt these things as it has all other technologies. So I would offer the thing of those of us who are also out there just building alternative ways to commercially and financially collaborate need to also, when we are successful, help support these new ventures as well. And I think that's the key for us, is that the finance for these new things has to come from the new systems of finance as well, and work out how to pull and change. So that was the big takeaway from us, is we've got to change the substrates.
So there were three key themes in our breakout group. One was that all of us who've been working in this kind of field for a while have gone through some kind of consciousness change. And when we're talking to other people, we may need to support them to go through a consciousness change before they can even begin to take in what we're trying to tell them. The second key theme, which links to that, is that the whole choice of language that Fyodor mentioned at the beginning, we're all using different languages. So even if you do have the capacity to hear, you still may not be able to hear, or may even hear the opposite, because we're speaking different languages. And the third that I brought in, and Natsai, let's follow up afterwards if you want. For the past 15 years, I've been developing ways of using existing company law to incorporate companies as if each company is a bee that collaborates together with other companies to form a beehive, and ways of investing that mimic the collaborative, competitive way that nature works, rather than our ideological focus on competition. So that may well answer your final question of governance and funding architecture.
Not everybody's in the system. I do think people who have mainstream jobs and went mainstream pathways have to have an awakening to have these conversations. But I'll just speak for myself and say, the way I was raised, I was never fully in the matrix. I always thought something was off at a deeper systems level, and was really excited about learning about ecological economics in high school, and thought I would meet those people in university, and they weren't there. And I went and found them in conferences and stuff. And it's the same, like, I'll go to events and they're like, who had an awakening with drugs? I'm like, well, we didn't need, like half the room will raise their hand and had some psychedelic awakening experience. And other people are just awake. So
I think strangely, I agree with all of the three speakers, even with the conflict held between Graham and Clea. And I think I was in the breakout with Natsai and just would love to see this formed as a financing ecosystem. How do we not just conceptualize this as what one type of funder would understand, philanthropy, the investors that are too blinded by biotech or AI or whatever's going on, but how to actually build that set of systems as emerging capabilities to fund this as an alternative. And just, really curious to have you be part of this community in any way that we can help. Some of us have been near it. Some of us have studied it. The steps 1, 2, 3 to 100 to get out of like trying to keep hitting the head against the investment wall of like, no, this is too much. It's too big. It's not narrow enough.
I was in Graham's group, and one of the things that sort of addressing what Jen is talking about, and I think that the sort of process of convergence on language, on understanding, and it's a process that has been playing out in Fest itself, like especially in our finance group, is just a continuous coming together and continuously communicating, collectively sensing, and just evolving. Language evolves together through dialogue. It isn't really like a one-way flow or standardization. It's sort of like we come together, and as we work together, that's how the language evolves. And I feel like one of the things in finance that doesn't happen, that sort of is causing this disconnect, there's this hierarchical or sort of like detachment from the outcomes themselves, where you're sort of appealing for funding for a specific project, but the people who are providing the funding aren't involved, nor are they like very literate in what's happening, nor are they really directly participating. So the real value is not communicated, nor is it like shared. So if we want to really build these financing systems that would work for these types of projects, it's like having all the people in the room and at least establishing a baseline understanding of what journeys we're going to go on together, instead of having this sort of very disconnected relationship between finance and projects.
I'll just respond to that quickly. Because that is very true. This is why I like even like the idea of trust-based philanthropy, because it just is just trying to build in a different kind of relationship. And that's kind of where a lot of these things, it's kind of what we were talking about as well in our group about it being relational, right? And this idea of like spawning ideas and spawning systems versus it needing to be so structured. But what made me want to say something was that, Kalia, I want to address that I think we all have to be able to check our privilege when we have these kinds of conversations. Because what you said spoke to your access. And what it doesn't speak to is the so many people, even for myself, like my moment, I think was in college when I was in a library. I took a library class and I learned about agribusiness, and my that just got me to the land, and getting me to the land is really what locked me in. But I always had, like, again, I know my privilege, right? Like, even if I have come up in certain environments where it has been poor, whatever, like, I know that I still came from a family that valued academics. And so that is what was kind of like ingrained in me into my experience in my system. And that's kind of what I carried forward. There are many people who that's not going to be their path, and they're not interested, right? There's so much knowledge that also lies within the spirit and people's actual walk. And so I just want to, as we're thinking about, and I agree with you, there are a lot of people who are just who just get it, which is like how you find your tribe, and then like, cool. I think how do we find and fund the societies that are already doing the alternative things? There are many of us already out here buying with each other, being intentional about what we put on our bodies, caring about the land and the soil, being connected. Like, there are groups of people where that is already happening, right? How do we get the funding to go there? Because those are the alternative systems, right? But how do we do it in a way where it's almost like, how do you get the funding to go there and then stay there and circulate amongst each other as it's kind of like growing the spawn of a system? So I just wanted to just be able to say that, because I think that as we are even thinking about this at different we all come to it from different points, that we are always consistently acknowledging the privilege that we have when we come to a conversation and when we come to these sorts of ideas. Because it makes me think about like the microorganisms and macroorganisms. Everybody love worms, but nobody's talking about the bacteria that's there to know in order or make it happen, right? You may not see it, but a very, very important, part of the process. And so, I want that to be a thing that we kind of like carry in our hearts as we keep like toiling through these kinds of conversations, so that we really can come at it as a whole, and as a unit, so that we can work together to get the things that we're really speaking about.
Thank you, everybody. I want to hand it back to Natsai to kind of close out this conversation. And then after that, we'll go to Fyodor and Jen for announcements. But Natsai, would you care to close us out and share what's landing for you?
Gosh, thank you so much, everybody, for engaging and from a place of goodwill. It's been super interesting to hear what you have taken from this conversation. I think there's a lot to consolidate, but one of the things that I've written down that I think really speaks to the disconnect is not just where does the funding come from, but the behavior of the source, if I can call it that as a shorthand, insofar as what was just said, funders as part of the realization of the system, as opposed to, a bank transfer, like see you in 3 to 7 years, depending on the horizon. And I know people talk about that already, deeper engagement. But I think the project architecture in of itself is what that question reveals to me as being a site of design, is actually integrating that a little bit more. So yes, lots to think about. I don't think I have an answer to my question, my provocation, but I think there are lots of very interesting directions, and this group is working very hard at thinking about it from different angles. So hopefully more soon. Thank you very much for having me today.
Thank you so much for being here.
Wonderful. Thank you, Natsai. Yeah, and I hope that this is just a start of some conversations and hopefully can follow up with people. And we also will publish the recording.
I would like to say that I have been over and over again inspired by Natsai's work. She is a force to be fathomed with. So I thank her for speaking and guiding us. Thank you.
Thank you, Christiana.
Thank you,
Wonderful.
Christiana.
Yeah, and with that, we'll do the announcements real quick. Our next conversation is April 16th, and a big announcement. We are going to host semi-annual State of the Field gatherings at FAST starting on June 18th. And this is going to be a World Cafe, and we'll bring people from our partner networks and from the FEST community to talk about what we're sensing in the field, what's going on. Then we're going to track the evolution of the field as we host these gatherings. We're going to have no more than 50 people in this gathering because of the process constraints, but everybody who applies will find a way for them to weave into this conversation, maybe through what the finance group is doing at FAST with targeted conversations, or maybe we will connect you with somebody who will be at that gathering. And with that, I am handing it over to Jay.
Hi, everybody. So the FEST finance team has been working on how we fundraise for the field to address not all of the needs described in the chat, but how do we get folks that aren't able to get themselves to the key convenings to be able to support them. So we've just started. If you want to nominate someone who has been wanting to attend one of the convenings, if you have a recommendation for a convening, please nominate in the chat. Self-nominations are also welcome, and I've seen them happen. So the finance team will be trying to work on the back end and the fundraising to support travel budget and working with some of the convening organizations to provide free entry into sometimes expensive convening structures. And I'll leave it there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jen. Let's see. Oh, yeah. No. Okay. One link in the chat. I'll post the registration link, and thank you so much, everybody.